So welcome to the Psychology for a Safe Climate Conversations series for 2023. And tonight we'll be in conversation with Joelle Gergis. Hi Joelle, who's over there. I'm Christy Wilson, the Climate Aware Practitioner, Programs Coordinator for PSC, and I'm filling in tonight for Carol Ride, who's a psychologist, Executive Director and founder of PSC, who has unfortunately lost her voice through a cold. So hi Carol, thanks for being here. To orientate into the call together, I'd like to make an acknowledgement to country. So please go ahead and write in the chat the countries that you and lands that you're coming in from. So as we collectively acknowledge the First Nation, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the lands we live, work and love, we acknowledge their continuing connection to country, to culture, land and sea, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. We acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So now I'd like to introduce Joelle Gergis, eminent climate scientist and one of the lead authors on the IPCC 6 assessment report, who along with others, reviewers from around the world, peer-reviewed thousands of scientific studies as a volunteer and putting in those hours on top of her academic job at the Australian National University. And the reason PSC has invited Joelle for conversation is for how she interweaves climate science and the emotional impact of the work she has done and is doing for all of us, and for her strong passion to help us all understand humanity's moment. We cannot delay while there is time left to make an impact on the extent of heating to the planet before it's too late to intervene. So we'll just, I'll just read a quote, even that will be dropped into the chat from Joelle. There is power and wisdom in our emotional response to our world. Until we are prepared to be moved by the profoundly tragic ways we treat the planet and each other, our behaviour will never change. We will be opening questions towards the end of the event, opening the floor for questions to Joelle. So PSC, but this quote we just read, PSC is motivated by exactly this sentiment, which is why all of our work focuses on understanding the psychological impediments to engagement with the crisis we are in, and in giving people support to express their emotions, and in doing so, joining with others to increase self-understanding and self-acceptance. And most of all, knowing there is an outlet for this emotional engagement by advocating for the scale and speed of action needed for the sake of humanity. We also know that taking action with others in advocating for action in the climate crisis, in whatever ways that you can, is very good for individual and community mental health. So at the end of the event tonight, we'll be giving more information about PSC climate cafes, our workshops, interactive seminars, and the professional development training for mental health practitioners, educators, and academic researchers. So please stay on at the end for a few minutes if you have time. You're warmly welcomed. I'll now introduce you to Charles Lefevre, who is a psychiatrist and Deputy Executive Director of Psychology for a Safe Climate, and who has a long interest in the psychological aspects of the natural world and the climate crisis. So Charles will now be taking us into conversation with Joelle. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you very much for coming along this evening, Joelle, and thank you so much for your book.
It's
welcome.
My pleasure. No, thank you. It's really terrific to be here tonight speaking to this group.
Great, thank you. Well, look, before we get into the real nitty-gritty of the climate reality, emotion, self-care and hope, perhaps you could begin by just telling us a little bit about your own, when and how you got involved in the climate science and climate change.
Sure. So I guess as a young person growing up in a country like Australia, you know, we had my childhood, I guess, was punctuated by these extreme weather events. And I remember there was a really severe bushfire season in 1994, and I was a high school student. And I remember seeing, bushfire ash just floating through my neighborhood, and it was terrifying. And it was one of those things that I guess as a child that was really interested in the natural world and also interested in science, I wanted to understand how the Australian climate works. And I guess that curiosity led me to go on to study science at university. And I guess I've had, well, the rest is history in many ways, but I guess it stemmed from wanting to understand, well, what is it that makes Australia so erratic in terms of our weather extremes, and wanting to understand more about how the planet worked. But it was also that love for the natural world. I love natural places. I love the ocean, the bush, things like that. And I wanted to see how I could, I guess, shape my life into trying to do what I can, I suppose, as a privileged person in a country like Australia, as an educated person, to do what I can. So I suppose my curiosity came about from growing up in Australia, just like many people, I guess, and wanting to understand more.
Oh, well, thanks very much. It's it's interesting that you had that early contact with climate change as well. And look, let's really get into the hard stuff now, because you obviously had years of experience now in the whole climate science area and with the IPCC. And one of the things which it's really important for us in PSC is to really be aware of the climate reality. So I'm just wondering if you can, I guess, I know it's a big ask, but tell us how you see the current climate reality, if you like, and also what you think we need to urgently do.
Yeah, sure. So I guess anyone who's been living in Australia for the last few years has experienced some of the extreme weather events that we've had. So Black Summer, I think, in 2019, 2020 was a real pivotal moment in our history. In that particular bushfire season, we saw about 25% of Australia's temperate forest burn in a single bushfire season. During an extreme event, extreme bushfire season, maybe 2% might burn. So we're talking orders of magnitude greater than what we would expect just from a sort of background historical conditions. And after those fires, our most iconic species, the koala, is now an endangered species along the east coast of this country. Now, that's something that is a pretty confronting reality to come to terms with when you stop and think about what that means as an Australian. We're actually seeing ecosystems starting to collapse and come apart on our watch. So, sometimes when we talk about climate change, we think about these things as these very distant, far away, 2030, 2040, 2050, 2100. But in fact, what was really confronting to me as a scientist that was working on the IPCC report at the time is that you can have really abrupt change happen very quickly in the space of just a season. So in the space of just one single summer season, or bushfire season really, we saw the Australian landscape really transformed in radical ways that it hasn't really bounced back as well. So it's we saw 50% of our Gondwan and rainforest species, rainforest burn in a single bushfire season. And these are areas that don't usually burn. These are, moss-drenched areas that have been around since the time of dinosaurs. And we were seeing these forests burn for the first time in many places. So it was really, really confronting to witness that. And at the same time, we were also seeing the Great Barrier Reef was bleaching yet again. And over just a handful of years, we've seen 50% of the Great Barrier Reef actually die off. And that doesn't include the most recent mass bleaching event from 2022. So that's an underestimate in terms of where we are right now. So when you stop and you think about the reality of that, as Australians, we need to wake up to the reality that we are starting to see profound changes, not only in our natural ecosystems, but in our human societies. And of course, many of you would know about the East Coast floods of last year, 2022, where we saw entire towns effectively wiped off the map. My husband's family is from Lismore in northern New South Wales. We live in northern New South Wales when I'm not in the city teaching. And it was really, really confronting to see the firsthand effects of what happens when you start to get these extreme events that come one after the other, and they compound, and they actually start to displace people, and really you start seeing the fabric of our communities come apart. And so I guess to come back to the initial question, Charles, it's really of understanding that we are facing an emergency. And it's not a word that I use lightly. As a scientist, I've got to be very careful with my phrasing. And as a IPCC scientist, so someone that's worked at that UN level and sat at the table with representatives from all over the world, I realized, I guess maybe for the first time, that what was happening in Australia was being mirrored in so many different parts of the world. So in my chapter team, I had people from Colombia, from Pakistan, from all over the world, and we were all reporting these major changes in our particular part of the planet. And so I guess for me, the real motivation for writing this book was to try and convey the scientific reality as clearly as possible to ordinary people, so that they can engage in a conversation that feels inclusive, that doesn't feel so alienating with all the facts and figures. Although there are a lot of facts and figures in that book, I do take you by the hand and walk you through. So it's not, I hope it's not an inundation, but it is it's basically sort of takes you through my own processing of it. And I guess that's something we'll probably talk about further in this conversation, because I fast realized that a book that was just a whole bunch of facts and figures was not going to do the job that I needed, which was to try and to get people to connect emotionally to this topic. So maybe that answers that question.
Yeah, no, look, thank you. No, it does. I suppose the sort of, just going back to that question though, so just from the climate point of view, what do we need to do at the moment, or not do?
Right, so we're in what is called the critical decade. So basically from now until 2030, we need to halve global emissions and basically get to net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And that is an enormous task in terms of decarbonising the world's economies and starting to regenerate our natural places. It's enormous, and the challenge is there. But when you look at some of the reality of where we actually are under all the different climate model projections that are assessed in the IPCC's 6th assessment report, so the latest UN report, we are on track to breach 1.5 degrees of global warming in the early 2030s under all emission scenarios. So we have to come to terms with what that actually means. And so right now, that doesn't mean that the Paris Agreement targets, we can throw them away and they're not useful. It means that we might have some overshoot and we need to come back down. So this is really where we're at right now in terms of what the IPCC says. It's really one of the key messages is how bad we let things get is still very much in our hands. So whether we see 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees, 4 degrees, so on, that all depends on what we do within this next decade to turn things around. So it is an extraordinarily profound moment in human history. There's never been higher consequences, to be honest, because everything is playing out in the background of our planetary home. And now that is starting to be destabilized, it is starting to become intrusive. It's becoming part of the lived experience of not just here in Australia, although it's very clear what's happened here in Australia, but all over the world. You only have to watch the SBS news for 10 minutes to really get a sense of what is happening in the world. It's confronting, it's real, and it is upon us. So I guess it's one of these things that it is extremely urgent. And basically we're at a point where we have to figure out how much we can save and collectively what we want to do about that. So the time for being a passive bystander has long passed. Like, we're really in overtime here. We're really in borrowed time. And that's why I spend a lot of time towards the end of the book talking about the intergenerational aspects of this and the ethics of that. So it is really the people alive today that are going to determine the future course of humanity. And it's a big thing to say, but it's actually true. So it's when people ask me what's the most important thing I can do right now to address climate change, and I often, my answer increasingly is becoming, realize that you're living through the most profound moment in human history. That will help. starting there, and then everything else can flow from there. If you think that we have all this time, well, then you're not really in touch with the reality of the situation. So my, I guess, key message is that we need to wake up right now and realize that there's no time to waste. But the good news is a lot can be done, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. But coming to that realization of just how bad things are, I suppose, was part of the process of writing this book, I think, for me, because as somebody who does, the frontline sort of scientific research, I'm in front of it day in, day out. And I guess the average person isn't aware of it because they're doing other things, which is fine. I mean, it's normal that other people, you're taking kids to school, you're living your life. It's hard to take on this sort of planetary scale crisis, if you like. It's psychologically difficult. It's heavy. It is burdensome. So I guess I'm hoping to start a dialogue about what we can do at this particular moment. And I think as Australians, we have a lot to offer the global community at this moment as well.
Yes. Look, thank you. And look, one of the things you say in the book is, I'm quoting, if we don't put the brakes on now, then really there's not much hope left. So that's a pretty strong statement.
It is a strong statement. We're not at that point yet. We're not at the point of no return, in case anyone's on the line and wondering whether it is all too late. It is not all too late, and it's not a helpful way of thinking about it. But the longer I often like to use the medical analogy, like if say you got a diagnosis of cancer and you knew if you got it early enough, you could actually stop it, you could do something, you could avoid the worst consequences, you would take the action. And so I think we need to think about climate change in a similar way, of understanding that we have some very serious symptoms and signs now that can't be avoided. And some things are gone, some things are actually beyond repair, but there is still a lot we can save. And there's certainly a lot we can do to stabilize what is still with us. So I think if we think about it like that, it becomes a bit of a different way of framing it, because you wouldn't hesitate for a moment if a loved one had cancer. Wouldn't you throw everything you had at it to try and do what you can? And I guess that's what the scientific community and many others are trying to do, is to really try and ignite this social movement that we need to sort of turn this around. And that comes back to our cultural values. And that's something I guess we'll talk about as well.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, look, I think one of the things about your book is as well as you were saying, and has been said by Christy, is just how you do mix in the emotional side of it. And I guess that's what makes it so powerful. And that, I mean, in a way, just from what you were saying before, it's inevitable that we are going to have very powerful feelings about the climate situation. So
absolutely, it's a sense of loss and grief that we all feel. And I think I realized that I had to bring my full self to the page for this to be an honest book. I started off writing in a particular way, then I realized this isn't going to work like that. I had to put away my kind of academic armoring and just be a human being and sit down and be real. How would you really want to relate to someone and talk to them about what's going on? And from that place, the book flowed. It really did flow from that place. But it was really when I guess I gave myself the permission, because I must say it's quite taboo in science to talk about emotional topics and emotional responses. We're meant to be very objective and rational, but my feeling is that you can be objective and rational and professional, but still be a human being. So I think it's an outdated notion, and I would like to see that change, because I think the culture of science, we have some very sensitive and brilliant minds in our field, and deep thinkers and feelers, and I think we just don't often talk about that, at least not in public. We can talk about it when we're having a tea break at a conference, and we will talk about things sort of off the record, but you won't hear many scientists talk about how they really feel about it. But I thought, well, look, I'm going to write about how I feel about it, because I feel like it might help give other people permission to actually acknowledge that this is really hard. This is actually really difficult. But we don't stay in that place of feeling like everything's really difficult, but you have to start from a real authentic place. Otherwise, you're really just skirting around the edges. And as we know, you can never really deal with something unless you go straight through the heartland of it. So, that's just reality.
Yeah, no, look, I really appreciate that about your book. I mean, I think it's something great that you've really, really from the front line talk both eloquently and in a very moving way about the situation. And I think that's so important. As you say, I think it really, by sharing with other people some of your deep feelings about the situation, it really allows the readers to be able to maybe, hold their own feelings or talk about those sort of feelings to other people.
Yeah, and I guess that was part of what I really wanted to do, is I wanted the reader to find themselves in the pages and be able to relate to me as the narrator and find a part of themselves in there, because it's part of, I guess, our collective lived experience. And I'm just putting words to things that many people feel. I had emails from scientific colleagues emailing me saying, thank you. When I read your piece on XYZ, that really helped me realize that I also felt that way. So I think unless you're brave enough to actually put that on the table, and it is a vulnerability, and it's something that I was quite terrified, to be honest, when this book came out. I had a bit of a vulnerability overload moment where I was like, oh my God, I have just put out all this really personal stuff into the public. I can't take that back. But I realized that the stakes are so high, and if that is going to help someone in some way to connect, then I think it's worthwhile. So I feel like in some ways it's a bit of a personal sacrifice, because I'm actually a really private person. I'm a really introverted person. I'm a nerd, right? I'm a scientist. I spend a lot of time like by myself or looking at numbers and things like that. So it's not a natural thing for someone like me to do. So to write this book was actually a really big deal. And as I also share in the book, I also struggled with depression for a range of other sort of personal reasons. And so I guess that also informs the way I deal with this issue, because I'm a human being. I'm not just a scientist. I bring my own personal history. And so part of what I've had to come to terms with is, how do you maintain faith in humanity when sometimes things are so grim, and you feel like, when you see the atrocities and you see the mindless destruction and just how insane things can feel, sometimes it's really hard to not get depressed. But then someone said to me, well, that's actually a really rational response to a really insane kind of irrational situation. So it made it sort of, and I hope that's helpful for people to hear, because it's a natural thing to feel angry or really sad or really despairing or, immense rage even around this stuff. And it's disingenuous to pretend like those emotions don't exist.
No, absolutely, and I guess this is exactly what we try to do in Psychology for a Safe Climate, to sort of really validate people's feelings that are genuine and very appropriate, if you like, to the situation. And perhaps I could just read a couple of your entries from your diary, which you have in the book, which are sort of very revealing of just how sort of terrible you felt at times. One was about despair. Something inside me feels like it has snapped, that some essential thread of hope has failed, the knowing that sometimes things can't be saved, that the planet is dying, that we couldn't get it together in time to save the irreplaceable.
Yeah, so that was a dark day, that one. That was a dark day, but I guess sometimes I feel that way. And I guess there is an element of truth to some things are beyond repair to some degrees. So I'm currently working on a podcast which is looking at sort of highlights of the IPCC report. And in one of those episodes, we talked to a coral reef scientist, and she's basically was telling us how this coral reef site that she'd been working on for 20 years is now effectively dead and basically lost to humanity forever, because those temperatures will not come back down in any reasonable time frame. And I think it's one of those things where we have to acknowledge that there are going to be really serious losses. I mean, how do you come to terms with the loss of an entire component of our biosphere? And here in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef is the largest living organism on the planet, and half of it's dead. right? So that's actually quite a profound thing to come to terms with. And I think as Australians, you know, David Attenborough often writes about Australia because we're such an extraordinary place. Like, you know, Australia has more unique plants and animals than anywhere else on the planet. So even places like Brazil or Madagascar or Papua New Guinea, all these exotic places you might think, Australia is number one when it comes to all of these, you know, unique animals and plants that we have. We're extraordinary. And so we are caretakers and custodians of this incredible part of the planet. And so for me as well, I feel like this book is told by an Australian scientist. We often hear about climate change told by many American men, let's be honest. That's fine, but there aren't a lot of diversity of the voices. So I really wanted to bring the Australian perspective of what it felt like, for instance, to be, you know, how when you walk through the Australian bush, it's just so alive and it can be deafening with all of the life sometimes. And when I was on my honeymoon in Japan, and I write about this and going to a Japanese forest and doing a big sort of pilgrimage walk, and just the whole landscape's devoid of life, not even seeing, the only life we saw was, well, it was roadkill. It wasn't even life. There was nothing there. And I think that contrast between the thriving diversity we have in a country like Australia and other places where we just don't have that anymore, where it's been so decimated, I think we have a unique perspective as Australians, and having the longest Indigenous culture, continuous culture in the world. I mean, I personally feel we have a really unique role to play in terms of how we frame this as this moment for us to reclaim our stewardship of the planet. And this is something that is known to Indigenous people all over the world. This is nothing new. We have just gone crazy with consumerism. We've lost the way. We've lost our connection to nature, to each other, to what really matters. And we've become these sort of mindless consumers. And we need to snap out of it. We need to realize that, hang on, we need to course correct. The planet is actually, the ice sheets are melting and we're destroying the world's rainforests, and things are actually starting to falter now. And I guess as a scientist, working at that UN level, I was able to see like all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and realize this is not just happening in Australia, it's happening everywhere. And so what are we going to do? And that's why I called this book Humanity's Moment, because it is our moment to step up and to reclaim our humanity as well. There was a chapter I found particularly kind of disturbing to write. It was really made me cry a lot, was the displacement of people from rising sea levels, particularly the really rich cultures of the Pacific Islands. And if any of you have ever been to the Pacific Islands, I mean, they're just the most gorgeous places with deep, rich roots into their culture and connection to the ocean. And these people are now being displaced from those lands, their ancestral lands, and it's like a severing. Even if you rehome them, there's a cultural connection that gets lost. And I think are we all good with that? I guess it was just that moment where I was just thinking, like, collectively, that's a cultural values thing. Like, are we all okay with that? And so that's where I feel like just reconnecting with what it is to be human and to be humane, I think is really important. So, you know, we can talk about climate science and we can talk about all the facts and figures, but ultimately it boils down to the people and the places that we love. And that's how it comes to me now. It really just comes down to the things that we care about. So we don't have to get too stuck in all of the conversations about emissions and drawdown, and we can have those conversations, they're fine, but not everyone's going to be able to participate in those conversations. But the conversations the vast majority of us mere mortals can really connect with are things like our cultural values, things like removing or creating the social license for something to go ahead or not. So we can either create or remove the social license for the continued exploitation of fossil fuels in this country. So right now we do have a change of government, and it is a really fantastic thing, but there is still over 100 different gas, oil and coal projects on the table. So are we going to continue so what are we going to do about it, guys? Like, this is our moment, right? So this is our moment as Australians to say, on behalf of the planet, we actually, because we are the largest fossil fuel exporter in the world, what are we going to do about that? So I think that's why it is this profound moment, because it's so consequential and it reverberates out for millennia. So it is a really critical moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, let's come in a moment. We'll come to sort of hope and the sort of things that you're sort of talking about in terms of really trying to have a social movement, if you like. But maybe we could just come back a bit more to sort of say the importance of talking about climate feelings, which is obviously something we do and something you sort of talk about in the book, about having the sort of tough conversations and how important that is going to be. Not just for us as individuals, but really in a sense for the whole culture to be able to have the space to be able to actually hold the sort of painful feelings that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think, the conversation's long overdue. And I think many of us feel it. We feel it in our private places, in our private spaces. But I think collectively we need to be coming together to talk about this because it is a reality. So I think most Australians now know that climate change is real. It's being caused by human activity, and it is going to continue to escalate the more carbon we put into the atmosphere. These are all just facts, right? So we do need to talk about what it is to be living through this profound, tumultuous, era in human history, and how we are going to choose to show up in that moment. And so that's going to bring up a whole range of different feelings. Like for me personally, as I mentioned, I live in northern New South Wales, and I often go walk the beaches there. And increasingly after these storm events, you can just see the coastline eroding and eroding and eroding and eroding. You can just see the creep of it all. Or going to rainforests where I love, and then seeing all the brown tinges where the fire stopped, and realizing, okay, those patches aren't going to grow back. We still have these. So, many of us, and I'm sure all of you probably have your own sort of unique places that really resonate with you when you think about where is it that you feel that the world is changing. It might be in your local park or whatever it may be, but we all have our own sort of personal connection to that. And I suppose for me, I guess as a writer, I feel the way I make sense of the world is to try and put it into words and to get it on paper, and then try and talk to other sensitive and thoughtful people who are deep thinkers, and realizing that there are people like that out there who really care about these things. Not everybody wants to talk about inane celebrity chefs and whatever. That's all fine. We all need our outlets. I'm not judging. All I'm saying is that we are in an emergency situation that does require emergency action. So I think it's just about, if someone like me can't be real about it, and I'm in front of it every day, then how can I expect other people to really understand? And so that's why I felt I had to be really honest in this book, and that's how it came to be. And in the moment that I was honest, it really flowed, because I feel like I'm just being human, and that's a collective universal feeling. I'm just trying to put some words around those feelings so that other people can then have their words around those feelings, and we can have a conversation. So I'm hoping this just starts conversations. Like this is a starting point. This is not the be all and end all. This is, I hope, helps ignite conversations in your own communities and groups and in your own self around how you feel, because it is a really profound moment. People think about these moments in history, like the 1960s, these revolutionary times, and think, wow, that seemed amazing. But, we're going to look back at the 2020s and say, well, where were you? Where were you in the 2020s? What did you do? How did you show up? And particularly if you have children as well, I really feel like that is something you want to be proud of, what you did at this moment. And I think we need better stories. And so in the last part of the book, I really enjoyed reading writers like Rebecca Solnit. Some of you might know the US writer Rebecca Solnit. She's amazing. She's so inspiring. And she wrote a really good book called Hope in the Dark, which was just profound. And she's got a new anthology coming out, which I've contributed a little essay to, which is called Not Too Late. Some of you might really enjoy it. It's got collected. It's a collection of essays from all over the world, which is basically telling this story, which it is not too late. So I put forward the scientific case, so that's my contribution, but it has other things. So if you haven't read Rebecca's work, please track it down, because she's very wise, and it makes me also realize that there's so many good people out there thinking about this in so many different ways. And maybe it was a revelation to me as a scientist, because I'm often reading scientific journals and things. I don't have a lot of time to read other material as much as I would like, but the the fact is that we all have something to contribute. And that's what I think is the beauty of this movement, is that it isn't going to be a bunch of nerdy scientists that lead the social movement. It's going to be people that are creating, I guess, our cultural change, and that can come from so many different places. And I guess we'll probably talk about that later as well. But there's really room for everyone in this movement. It's not just one size fits all.
Yeah. So can I just say something to Caroline? Caroline, I think I've actually got 10 minutes. I think we've got 10 minutes left. I think it's 6:50 that we move on. Isn't that right? Yeah, I'm got. So, sorry, Joelle. I just
That's
need
fine. Housekeeping.
Check on that. But
My apologies.
That's okay. Look, it just gave me a bit of a flutter there because we've got so much left to talk about. But I guess perhaps an area to go with this is partly carrying on from what you're talking about, and I guess a really important issue. Well, there are so many important issues, but I'm not quite sure which one to go with. Perhaps just briefly, self-care is something so important, and burnout. And I know that you talk about that in your book as something really, really important. And obviously, a lot of your self-care is very much tied up with the natural environment and how important that is.
Yeah, really it is. I mean, for me, the connection to the natural world, whether it be going for a walk on the beach or swimming in the ocean or going for a bush walk, or just being outside in a local park or anything like that, is just a reminder that you are a part of the natural world, and there is a life force that sustains us all. And when you tap into that, it does recharge you. And it also reminds you of part of the reason so much that there is so much worth saving. There's still so much beauty out there. And I think sometimes when you're around, really difficult material all the time, you can just see the ugliness of everything. And I think nature is a really beautiful antidote to that, where you can go and just be, I guess, just have your breath taken away by, a magnificent coastline or whatever it might be that really kind of restores something in you. And so for me, obviously, as I guess as a scientist, I'm really connected to the natural world and the way it works. But it's also people and finding solace in others, and finding other sensitive souls who have empathy and have shared interests and an ability to be sensitive when you are feeling raw. And so, if you are feeling really raw, it's probably not the time to go out and, talk to a bunch of climate skeptics, for instance, for me, because that's not a helpful conversation at the best of times, but it's particularly not when you're feeling vulnerable. It's not great. But I suppose it's just about pacing yourself and realizing you're in it for the long haul. And there's some days where it feels so overwhelming, and that's okay. Then you drop it, leave it, go do something, go to an art gallery, go for a swim, do whatever it is that you do to ground yourself, do some yoga, whatever it is that connects you back into the fact, connecting you back to the fact you're a human in a body. Because ultimately we're just animals on this planet. We're all just doing our best from day to day. I think it's important to just ground yourself and try and enjoy those beautiful things that are still there. And like I said, as Australians, you don't have to look too far. If you wake up early, you hear the dawn chorus, there's kookaburras, there's all sorts of things like this. We have so many things to remind us that we're part of an ecosystem and part of this very rich life force that sustains the whole planet. And we have a beautiful part of it here in Australia. So I think there are really good ways to do that. But burnout is a very, very real thing. And, there are times where the work will require a lot of you. So for instance, with IPCC, I was working around the clock. I start the book at 5:15 a.m. on a Saturday that I had an IPCC meeting, and I'm getting up because I'm the only Australian representative on that chapter, and I have to be there because I'm representing all of my people back at home. So I have to be there, right? So that's not the time to chill out and go and take a break, right? So you got to pick your moments of when it's time to do the work and when it's time to rest. And just like everything in nature, everything ebbs and flows. And your energy ebbs and flows, and just knowing that, I think, is really important, and learning to tune into those cycles of your productive times, your not so productive times, but also the stage of your life as well. That changes. I've been finding as I'm getting into my sort of middle years that, I've got to be really protective of my energy sometimes, and I've got to learn the word no. I get asked on a daily basis to do all sorts of stuff, but I'm only choosing to say yes to the things where I feel that ignite my interest, or I really want to connect with a particular group of people. Or so things like that I think can help you with burnout, because you only have a finite little jar of energy, or whatever you want to call it, and you need to dole it out really carefully, because it's a precious resource. I hope that helps. Yeah,
no, that's really helpful. No, thank you for sharing how you deal with your self-care, which is again something we try and help people with. But now I want to ask you a sort of, again, another difficult question about how can we find hope when the crisis is getting worse and we're not taking enough action. I know you've written kind of quite a lot about that and how we can find hope. I mean, I also like it, the fact that you've talked about that you can have despair. Despair and hope aren't necessarily opposite, that they can go
they
together.
coexist. They really do coexist. I think these things are not so black and white. And I guess for me, these last few years have been just such a difficult time for everybody. We've dealt with COVID. We've dealt with all sorts of extreme weather events. For me, I dealt with IPCC on top of all of that. And I guess through it all, I saw a lot of really interesting things. So for instance, when during the Black Summer bushfires and our precious places were on fire, we had volunteer firefighters going out to protect our collective places that we love. When you think about the healthcare workers on the front line of the COVID crisis, they were working around the clock to try and protect our communities. And then there I was, part of an IPCC community, volunteers. We're all volunteers working, for 3.5 years for free on top of our day jobs. So you can't tell me that there isn't goodness in humanity. You only have to look around you to realize that. And also with the East Coast floods, how when the SES didn't turn up, neighbours got in their kayaks and their dinghies, and they turned up and they literally saved hundreds of people. I had family members that did that, even though they were flooded out of their own house. They got in a kayak and they went and got everybody else that they could get from their street. And I think when it comes back down to it, it's so easy to get so polarized, and you're thinking that everybody, or no one cares about this, or people are terrible, or that kind of black and white thinking. And I'm guilty of it too. But the reality is people can be really awful, but they can also be magnificent at the same time, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
I think if we just sort of think about how we want to show up in that moment, we want to be that person that restores someone else's faith in humanity. We don't want to be one of those people that is just the person that is making everybody sort of tear their hair out, right? So we know what that person feels like, and that person has their own issues, and okay, but you can only control you, right? So you can only take control of how you want to show up in the moment, and what kind of legacy you want to leave. Do you want to be part of the people who actually tried their very best with whatever they had to do what you could? Or do you just want to be someone that becomes a sort of passive, disconnected, depressed, jaded, bitter? And I swing between the two of them, to be honest. I'm not trying to say for a moment that I always have this sorted. That's why I'm being really honest about this. So please, if you're interested in what I'm saying, read this book, because there's a lot of my own struggle with this. Like there are times where I feel like, oh my God, humanity it seems doomed. And other times where I see the very best in humanity and I think, no, hang on a sec. We've also got a history of this. And I also write about the whole, the social movements in human history of civil rights and gender equality and all these things, that they're not a done deal. They're a constant battle. This struggle for, this tug of war for social justice is ongoing, and climate change is the latest thing in this long continuum of human history. And if you can stop and think about this moment like that, it changes everything. And that's why I was trying to say, coming back to the very, very first point I made, the most powerful thing you can do right now is realize you are living through a historic moment, the most historic moment that this planet is ever going to face. And you are part of this extraordinary generation that can leave a legacy. And how amazing is that? Yes, it's also a huge burden, totally. Okay, it's not going to be easy. It's hard, but it's totally worthwhile. And it provides us with immense meaning. If you stop and you think about the things that are worth doing in life, I think this is one of those things. Take a day off, by all means. Like if you need to take a breather, but do what you can where you can. And I guess that is really where that's probably how I would sum it up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I mean, it really is towards the end of the book, there was a lot of sort of hopeful messages like that, where you talk about the forces for good and social movements and social tipping points, which are really, really important. And I can see your connection with the sort of Rebecca Solnit and the sort of light that she brings to situations.
She's amazing. And for me as a scientist, to read her work, to really connect up with other people who are thinking about these things, it was a revelation to me. And I guess it's just so good to know that a lot of deep thinkers thinking about this. So we just need to tell better stories about how we want to vision this future world and bring it into reality. And that's really it. So yes, it's hard, but let's get over that bit. Let's start building the better world that we want. And I think that's a meaningful thing to do, but you're not alone. And I think for me, even it was so nice to be able to have the opportunity to read writers like Rebecca. And it really motivated me, because it made me feel like somehow the burden lifted a little bit from my own shoulders, where I realized, like, I'm just one person in all of the people that want to do something. I'm just lending my voice and my life force to it at this moment. Yes.
Well, look, thank you very much. Look, I'm going to think I guess we can continue with the conversation with the questions, but I think we're at time now probably to go in a few minutes to have questions. So if people could place the questions in chat, and but now, just to finish off this segment, Joelle very kindly has agreed to read an excerpt from her book.
Yeah. It's just a couple of paragraphs I just wanted to leave you with, something where, I got to with my writing. So I hope you enjoy it. The sense that nothing can or ever will change is one of the hallmarks of depression. As Rebecca Solnit puts it, the despair felt like a stall, a becalming, a running aground. Believing that things will ever get better is still something I grapple with when things get really bad. Although I cycled through this enough times to know that these feelings will eventually pass, when I'm in the grip of darkness, I honestly don't believe it ever will. I'm slowly learning that I need to be patient and remember that eventually the wind will pick up and catch my sails once more. I've also discovered that I have people in my life who are willing to wade in and give me a nudge until the stick of the sand beneath me gives way and I'm back in open water. But when I boil it all down, what gives me hope comes down to this. There is still so much goodness in humanity. Even if you can't see it around you, or have stopped believing that it even exists, there is still something good in all of us. When I'm really down, I have to trust that eventually, when the darkness has finally dissipated, I will be able to see again. Until then, I need to hold on and be guided by the light in others. When I allow myself to shelter in their compassion and care, it stills my own flickering light until eventually it starts to steady itself and glow a little brighter.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful piece. Thank you. Thanks very much. So perhaps I'll hand over to Christy to give us some questions from the chat, if they're coming in.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you, Joelle. That was a beautiful chapter to read. We have got 2 questions here. So everyone, if you do have questions for Joelle, you can continue popping them in the chat. But Zach here says, I'm 18. Thank you for being here, Zach. And they say, is my future going to be significantly worse than my present or past?
It's a really good question, Zach. I think, this is exactly what we're fighting for at this very moment. We're wanting it to be not as bad as it is right now, but if we continue on the current trajectory that we are on, then things will escalate and get worse. And I'm sorry to have to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the truth. But the thing is, the good news is there are people all over the world who are doing absolutely everything they can around the clock to turn this around. So I'm coming to you as a climate scientist who's worked on the IPCC and trying to give you as much information to help you make decisions around how you want to show up and be a part of those conversations. But in terms of the young people that are doing things, there are all sorts of people who are really fighting for change. I mean, Greta Thunberg has a book out at the moment, which is, I contributed a chapter to, which really collates a lot of the latest information and is really inspiring. So I guess it's one of those things that we have to look to the future with our eyes wide open. There's no point in being in denial, and we have to see what's there. So the most honest thing I can say is that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, right? But you can choose what kind of legacy we leave in terms of, are we part of the group of people that are going to try and make things less worse? So this is why it is humanity's moment, because it's not just for Australia, it's everywhere. So yes, but you are living through a profoundly important time, but you're not alone. There are many of us with you, you know, my generation and even the elders above me. So, you know, you're a part of something. So even though it feels heavy and it feels terrifying in some ways, we do one day at a time, we do 1 week at a time, we move forward together. So I hope that helps. But one of the key messages from IPCC is, you know, how bad we let things get is still in our hands. So we aren't facing runaway climate change at this moment, but we are facing some destruction. But how bad it gets really comes down to the decisions and all the action that happens in this next decade. This is why it's called the critical decade and why it's so important.
Thanks, Joelle.
That's also how important it is, the whole intergenerational aspect of things, as you were talking about earlier, that what you know, well, one thing we know is from the paper we talked about from Caroline Hickman and in the Lancet Planetary Health, which really shows the level of distress of a lot of young people, and how important it is for us to, with our work, well, whether it's psychological or just, well, helping with the planet, that how important it's going to be for future generations.
Absolutely. I devote a whole chapter of the book, Zach, to that in terms of future generations, because there were moments in that book where I felt like I just want to stop writing this book, and then I realized that I can't stop writing this book because of young people. I can't stop writing this book. So I had to put aside my own sort of thing to just move forward and realize this is bigger than me. And so there's a whole chapter on the intergenerational element, which I really strongly, I feel it deeply. Yeah.
There's a question here, Joelle, from Damien.
Yeah.
Who says, does Joelle have a perspective on how we balance the need to have people understand the scale of the crisis with the desire not to cause people to be immobilized by the fear and anxiety?
Yeah, so that's the fine line we all walk, particularly someone like me, being a scientist, wanting to inform the public. I think you've got to meet people where they're at. So not everyone has the capacity to absorb all the information. It's just as simple as that, for various different reasons in their life. So I think it just really comes down to the individual. Some of us have more capacity, so those people can really absorb the information and do what they can. And other people, it might be their life stage, they might be dealing with illness, or maybe they're too young or too old, or whatever it might be. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think my approach is to be really realistic about things. I'm not Pollyanna-ish about it, but I'm also not a doomsdayer. I really don't think that's a helpful narrative right now. I think people need, like, you just think about it, the medical analogy. I find it helpful. If you go to your doctor, you want them to tell you, how bad is it? Like, seriously, tell me how bad it is. And then from that place, we can make a decision about what we do about it together. And I think if you think of it like that, some people, everybody's different in terms of what they can cope with, but I'm a firm believer in it's best to be grounded in reality. It can be hard. That's why we're talking about it.
Joelle. Lucinda's saying, hi, Joelle, and thank you for your presentation. I listened with interest to the Fear and Wonder podcast preview last night, and I'm wondering if it's still going ahead.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Fear and Wonder is a new podcast that's being funded by The Conversation, which is a news media organisation. And yes, I'm going to be co-hosting a 7-part podcast series. We're about halfway through the recording at the moment, so it's actually why I'm in Melbourne. We've been recording it at the State Library, which is fantastic. They've got lovely studios down there, and it will start to get released, I think, later this month, because the final volume of the IPCC report, which is called the synthesis report, will come out. So it's going to be timed around then. So yep, it's definitely happening. So
Right.
take a listen if you want to have it's very conversational. So it's, if you maybe don't want to read a book, although please do read the book because I wrote it and I'd really appreciate people absorbing it. But if you really can't for whatever reason, the podcast is also really useful, I hope. Yeah.
Thanks. And Lindsay is saying, thanks so much, Joelle. I deal a lot with climate issues and I'm astonished at the extent to which we all cling to our lifestyles, even though we all know our lifestyles are wrecking the world. What message do you have to help people to voluntarily buy into such personal change?
Well, I think the knowledge is power is the first thing, like of realizing the personal impact you do have. So you can choose a lifestyle that doesn't really wreck the world as much. I have a whole section in there about the meat industry, and I know it's an uncomfortable topic for people because it's very, food choices are very personal, they can be cultural, but I do talk about that. And so it was one of those things that, my editor was a little bit like, oh, I don't know. I'm like, no, we've got to go there. I'm sorry, got to go there. So it's one of those things where you can choose. So whether it might not be around your dietary, choices, but it can be about the way that you live in terms of how you get around, what you do with your days, how you vote, what you buy, all those different things. So for me, it's about bringing awareness to those things and walking the walk. So, there's no point in pointing the finger at other people if you're not doing the thing that, you would like to see. So that's really where I think it's really empowering and it feels really good to do those things. So again, don't look outward, look inward first to try and change the way you're doing things. And also, collectively, when everybody starts doing good things, then we end up with a good society, right? But if we start being very selfish and not thinking about the consequences, but sometimes people don't know. So some of the statistics in there about meat, they're confronting. Okay, so you can do what you want with that information. I'm not saying you have to do anything with that information, but you might want to do something about it if you do feel moved by what you hear, for instance. But it's not for me to tell you what to do. But it wouldn't be bad to stop and think about the way that you're living, because it has an impact on other people. Yeah.
I just want to let you know that Zach said thank you for the response, Joelle. It was much appreciated. Last question. And also Claire has said thanks, Joelle. Appreciate your focus on the agency and collective action, and very inspiring. And then there's a question here from Bronwyn. The majority of folks in my community are struggling in the current economic situation and grappling with competing priorities to fight for. I know there's a strong connection between cost of living, social inequity and climate change, but I'm struggling with how to communicate that to get the community to fight for solutions. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, the struggle is real, is the first thing I would say there. This is a really difficult time for, I think, many of us really, we're living in difficult times. The circumstances are challenging, but isn't it exactly the moment where, imagine if we had a government decided to just say, okay, cost of living, let's just really totally offset all of our electricity prices by subsidizing solar, community batteries everywhere, let's just do it. We could do that. And I think that the federal government is taking steps towards that, but I guess that would help a lot if we weren't paying, for instance, electricity bills. But again, it's about who we vote for and what we ask of or demand of our politicians and our leaders, for instance. So I think it comes down to things like that, but yeah, look, what you're saying is really real. But then, it's also keeping in perspective that as Australians, even though our own circumstances might not be fantastic, I write a lot about the developing world and just how bad it is for people who have like no agency, really. They might be living in shanty towns in parts of, Nairobi or Mumbai. And so when you stop and you think about yourself as a global citizen, it might help reconfigure your perspective. So I get it. Like, it is really difficult right now for a lot of people, but it's also where we need our structural change. So this is where I feel like our activism towards what we do in our local communities really matters. And I have examples in there in the book about, the town of Yakandanda in Northern Victoria that banded together and got this community battery. And I just think it was so inspiring to just think about how communities can really go move forward and start to really live that change that we want to see. So I'm not saying necessarily you're going to go get a community battery in the city of Melbourne or something. Well, that'd be great. Let's be honest, it would be great, but maybe we need to work towards those things. So I guess this is so in this moment of crisis, it is a moment of opportunity as well. So it's like sort of thinking about, well, are we over consuming? Do we really need to drive the car all the time? Right. So, you know, for a lot of people that are struggling with petrol prices and stuff like that, it is a moment to stop and think. I'm not judging anyone around that. I'm just saying it's just an opportunity to stop and think about your own personal, the way that you interact and how you lead your life. So maybe that's a few thoughts on that one. It's a difficult question. Yeah.
Great question. And David's saying, Joelle, given your courageous journey and personal reflections whilst writing the book, has it changed your focus on climate change in any way?
Yeah, big time. I think writing this book is, as I've said to people close to me, I think it's the most important book I'll ever write. And I think I changed as a person as a result of writing it. I think it made me, I think in the past I used to compartmentalize my work from my personal life, but then all of a sudden I realized that that was just a way of sort of dissociating from the material. But when it started to become really intrusive, like when I had family displaced from flooding in Lismore, or also got evacuated by fires, and seeing my own neighborhood really transform from extreme weather, I really realized that this is the moment. And so for me, what can I do as a scientist? Do I publish another paper, research paper? Yes, I can do that. But it felt like the most important thing I could do was just distill everything I've learned over the last sort of 25 years of my sort of research career and time teaching and all that sort of stuff, and try and just pass it on in a hope that it lands with the people that need to hear it. It ignites a conversation and it helps in some way. So yeah, it really did change me, because it made, you know, how I was saying before, realize that you're living through the most important moment in human history. It made me think about, what am I going to do in this important moment in human history? Turns out that I'm a writer as well as a scientist. So one of my superpowers is communicating. So I am communicating in the hope that I can help spark conversations for other people to have more conversations and do all the things that you can do. I'm trying to bring my skills to the table to help. But yeah, so I guess it made me really sort of realize that the most meaningful and powerful thing I can do right now is communicate directly to the public. I'm getting less enthusiastic about sort of teaching university students. Sorry for any university students on the line. It's fine. I've done that for many, 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 many years, but I just feel like I want to talk directly to people who really want to listen to what I have to say and can action it, because I'm literally coming off the front line to say, hey guys, we need your help. Yeah.
Thanks. There's another one here from Dash. Joel, can you recommend any particular potent avenues for action on local scales which need more focus? I suppose you'll say do whatever you can and anything and everything, but just wondering if there are any specific organisations or actions you reckon could have the biggest bottom-up systemic effects.
Yeah, it depends on where you are, I suppose. So it's a hard one for me to answer without knowing where you're located, but I think the first thing is figuring out what action is going on already in your local community, and trying to be a part of those things. I think a really obvious one is trying to sort of decarbonize your electricity systems and your transport and all that sort of stuff. That's really something easy you can do, that is really powerful, and it is really collective, and it can be really meaningful in terms of reduction of emissions. But it also just comes back down to who is representing you at the local level in terms of your councils. Are they taking a stand for the things that you really care about? If they're not, then write them letters, go and meet them, go and talk to them, do what you can to, you know, yeah, I guess have leadership that is courageous. And didn't we not see that in the last federal election, where we saw a new breed of independents and the Green candidates and other progressives in different parties come forward in this last election, and we saw a political tipping point, didn't we? We saw something shift in Australian society in this last election, which to me says that we're all really hungry for this change. And so I think political leadership at every level, whether it's the local, the state, the federal, the global, whatever, however you can age in that. But I think getting behind the people that are representing your values, I think is really important, more important than ever, because actually everything starts at the local scale. So if you can stop and think about, you know, what your local council or local area, government area is doing, and getting a bit more involved. Because if you do care, you know, it's usually the coalition of the willing that gets anything done, right? A lot of people are so apathetic or don't have time and blah, blah, blah. But if you do have the time and you do care about something, then do that thing that you care about, because that's going to be the most powerful thing you can do right now. So there's no prescription I can give to what should you do. That really comes down to your passions. For some people, I talk a lot about cultural change and the role of artists, and I really hope that creative people really enjoy that part of my book, because I also think it comes back down to the stories that we tell and how we make sense of this cultural moment that we're in. And that isn't necessarily about solar panels. That's part of it, but it's not, you know, there are many, many different ways to engage in this conversation right now. And that's what I'm hoping this book helps people feel like, oh yeah, I actually think I know what I can do. And I don't mean that in a glib way. You'll see, like it's hard won insight, this book, in terms of, because I deal with depression, it's like, go talk to a depressed person and ask them where they find hope. That's basically this book. So it's not like, I'm not going to give you any you know, like it's the real deal, if that makes sense. So anyway, I hope that helps. I'm getting a bit tired and rambling, sorry.
Jump in, Charles.
Yeah, look, I just had a bit of a question about a cultural question, I suppose it is. I think we may have talked about it before, but this book by the British psychoanalyst whose name escapes me.
Sally Weintraub.
Sally Weintraub, thank you, called The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, describes what she calls as a sort of culture of uncare at the moment, which I think is a very important thing for us to think about, because it basically means, well, what she describes as a sort of being in a bubble of uncare, and so that we think about consumer things, as you were saying, but we don't think about, you know, the things that are really important in the world, and particularly climate change. So I guess one question is, yeah, I mean, that's something very difficult to change. It's a sort of another form of denial in a way, that people are just, you know, sometimes when they do come to our workshops, for example, or whatever, suddenly the bubble bursts. But it's a sort of very difficult thing. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I think the cultural values idea is something that I really explored in the book, because I realized it's about what we collectively value. So whether that is, you know, the AFL results, and we all care about that, well, how about we have a collective value around the protection of nature and the protection of life on this planet, and having that as something that is a shared value, that we have a value for the, you know, the Great Barrier Reef, we care about that existing. So this culture of uncare is really this disconnection from, you know, if you stop and think about humanity's roots, you know, we would have lived in tribal groups and would have cared about who was in that group and the environment around us. But the further away from that we've come, and we're all living in our little boxes and disconnected from people, people do stop caring, because they can't see where their food comes from, or can't see that the ocean is polluted, or can't see, you know, some of the consequences of this disconnection in our collective care for our world and for each other. I mean, this is the thing, like, it isn't just about the natural world, it's about it's also about the world's poor and the people who are vulnerable, and you know, how we treat our most vulnerable speaks volumes of who we are as a species, and I think those are the things that are really coming to light right now. And so it is really, climate change really is a social justice issue more than probably anything. People think about it as an environmental issue, but it's actually a social justice issue, in terms of, you know, the world's poor are bearing the brunt of just mass consumerism and overconsumption from wealthy nations. That's the truth. Historical emissions essentially come from the developed world. the developing world have got the emissions ramping up now as they are developing, and they have every right in a sense, but it's like we have to stop and think about that. So that's why what I guess I am challenging the reader to think about. Well, what is it to be human at this moment? What is it to be alive and be a human at this moment? What are we doing?
Yes. Well, I guess one of the other sides of it, in a way, is, and what Sally Weintraub talks about, is if you do burst the bubble of uncare, then it brings up a whole lot of very uncomfortable feelings, which is exactly what you talk about also in your book about the grief. And it's, I guess this is something very important, that we're sort of, in a way, a lot of people can live a very superficial life in this sort of culture of uncare, whereas when it comes down to it, there can be real grief. And this is what happens in our workshops, that we have people who come along and once they they say, well, look, we've never really talked about these feelings before. And
well, I think that bubble you spoke of, Charles, is really a protective bubble. It's a bubble of denial. Once you remove that, then people are vulnerable. And I guess this is what you guys are trying to do, is provide people with a safe space to be able to talk about, well, what happens once we actually step out of our protective bubble of denial, and because it protects us. I mean, we need it to some degree, but again, with the medical analogy, do you really want denial if you've got cancer? Don't you want to deal with it? We actually do need to deal with it. So so if you did have the cancer, then there's going to be a bit of grief around that, in terms of, oh gosh, my life is now, I might have a limited lifespan. What can I do to protect the life that I do have? And you act from that place of knowing. And I think, to me, this is really the journey in this kind of space for a lot of people. But it speaks to really deeper things about how you find meaning in a world that is rapidly destabilizing in many, many ways. And how do you be part of, the group of people that are trying to forge forward with solutions to really improve the situation, not to make it worse. So, big things. They're big themes.
Charles, that might be a good segue to jump into Michael's comment here. So Michael says, Joel, thank you so much for your passion, commitment and contributions. Can you talk to the fact that, as far as I understand, all the IPCC RCPs incorporate considerable or even vast drawdown with technologies we don't have yet? Even 1.5 is not safe, let alone 2 degrees. I recall BZE saying 10 years ago that we'll need to build the reverse of the biggest industry mankind has ever built, the petrochemical industry, and I see no sign of that happening.
Yeah, that's an astute comment, so thank you for that. Yes, it's true that all the IPCC scenarios do involve some level of drawdown in their scenarios, and obviously that's that's a big deal. And that's also why people are talking about the nature-based solutions to try and sequester carbon in whether it be in the ocean or through land-based ecosystems, wetlands, the restoration of natural places that do soak up those sorts of emissions. But land emissions are just 30%. Obviously the industrial emissions are about 70% of the emissions that we need to draw down, as you say. It's a huge problem, and this is why the IPCC are saying that we really need to turn the tap off emissions. So, and then we need to mop up. Okay, so we need to turn the tap off, which is the whole thing around decarbonisation. And you're right, 1.5 degrees, for instance, sees 90% of coral reef ecosystems die off. And I would argue that if I was a Pacific Islander, I wouldn't say that's a safe level of climate change. With 1.5 degrees of global warming, that's displacing a lot of people. That's displacing, tens of millions of people from low-lying areas. So I agree, but you've got to understand that the science is really complex. It's very, very challenging to parameterize some of these elements in these imperfect systems, these models. But they're the best tools that we have. So I guess you see it more as a guide in terms of, it's very difficult. They're kind of like an indication of the projection of what we can expect from the different pathways, from low emissions, medium emissions to high emissions. So they are different pathways, and I do actually talk about all of those in my book. So again, if you want serious detail, you can go in there. But I agree with your general point, which is it's true. It's true that, you know, we have not included all the different elements of, you know, the climate system in our climate models. It's like trying to write an equation for how, you know, every component of the human body, how that works. As you can imagine, it's a really difficult thing. The Earth system is extraordinarily complex, so it's really hard. But I guess the other point is that, you know, some of the technologies we need to draw down, you know, they don't exist. And I guess this is part of the problem. So I guess as a scientist, I would like to just say, so let's just stop emitting carbon until we know how to sort this out. So, you know, there are natural systems that, as I said, sequester carbon, but they operate on geologic timescales, so we don't really have that sort of time. So we can do other things, which is turn off the tap, and then nature-based solutions will help with some of those emissions. But yeah, it's true, 100%. Like I said, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Yeah.
And we're just coming to time for the Q&A. So there's another final question here. I apologise to all the questions we didn't get to. It's just a time thing. And there's a question here from David. Do you think that this global climate crisis will enable the so-called culture wars to unify, reduce intolerance and socially heal such groups?
Oh, I love that question.
A banger for the end for you.
Oh, it's really good. Because that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? It's not what divides us, it is what unifies us. Let's be part of the group of people that want to come together on the things that unify us. All this divisive stuff, it's really just not helpful. And yes, it's, you know what, that's probably going to continue to exist. It's been with us since time immemorial. I'm sure back in the day, you know, cave people had big divisions in terms of whatever, right? That's probably always going to be the case. But I guess it's like how you show up in the moment, and do you choose to be a bridge between the different communities, or do you choose to be someone who's polarizing and stopping that healing and unity that we need? So I guess it's like one of those eternal questions, which is we're always going to have people in our communities that want to undermine and want to be divisive. Unfortunately, that's the human condition. You guys know a lot more about the human condition than me, so I'm not going to tell you guys anything you don't know. But I suppose it's just like, as a human being, I would just choose to show up as someone that is willing to be a bridge rather than to be kind of detonating any kind of opportunity for knitting together and healing and coming together, because that's what this humanities moment is all about. Can we reclaim our humanity and join up? Because we have immense capacity to do that. And when we do that, we change the world. There's no doubt about it. The history's full of it. That's what I loved about this book in the end, which brought me out of my depression as I finished writing it, is that I realized that actually everything we need to do this actually exists right now, except for some of the drawdown, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But it's, in terms of the social movement, it all is there. So we can do this, is what I want to say. And, you know, it's our moment to think about how we show up. So I've really enjoyed tonight's discussion. It's really good to have a different kind of conversation for me. So I don't know if there's any other questions, but yeah.
Thanks, Joelle. It's been a long night for lots of questions and such an amazing overview of your book, and Charles, the interview. So maybe we can all give a, you know, thank you to Joelle.
I loved the conversation. Thanks for the invite, guys. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, and thank you for the conversation, Joelle. I really enjoyed it, and great. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And I so appreciate the fact of how honest emotionally you've been in the book. I mean, it's so great, and not only been so helpful for you, but for all your readers. So thank you.
And then we just wanted to talk about the climate cafes that we've been running through Psychology for a Safe Climate. And at these climate cafes, there's no guest speakers, no advice given, no call to action. Instead, you find a supportive, facilitated conversational space for people to gather and share their thoughts and feeling in response to the climate crisis. And we piloted a whole series last year, and we've started them again this year. Caroline, who you can see here, is co-facilitating them with myself. And I think the link's been dropped into the chat if you'd like to register and come along for those climate cafes. There's some pretty amazing conversations coming into those. Then we have the next slide. This is about the interactive seminars and workshops for groups and organisations and communities that PSC do. So we're giving workshops such as giving expression to your climate grief, and as the climate is changing, how are you, and beating burnout. And our interactive seminars is a space to listen, give expression to your feelings, to connect with others, and focused on the climate distress, burnout, self-compassion, and self and community care. Everybody's welcome to come along. And this is we've got a professional development for climate aware practitioners. So this is a three-part series, a three-part training, and then people can onboard into being a climate aware practitioner with PSC. And the first one's engaging with the climate change and eco-distress. PD2, reflections and responses to the climate reality, and PD3, being present with climate distress applications to professional practice. Everyone's welcome to come along. I just did want to mention PD 1 and 2 is open to everybody, and then PD3 is a stream that moves into mental health practitioners, clinical practitioners. And yeah, we're building a climate aware practitioner network. So after the completion of the full PD series, you can apply to join PSC's Climate Aware Practitioner Network. CAPS is Climate Aware Practitioners, and you can get a profile on the PSC website and an opportunity to post your services. And there's peer support groups and ongoing professional development. Holding Hope in Uncertain Times, and the public talk by a CAP member, Caroline, in person in Melbourne, fundraising for psychology for a safe climate. So everybody is welcome to come to that. And the next slide, Carol. And we do kind of ask the community to support our work. We're a non-for-profit organisation, and we're a registered charity for health promotion. We do depend on donations, grants and payments for our services, and we're a team of committed volunteers with 3 part-time staff. So please go ahead and sign up for our newsletter, become a member, and just see if there's anything extra to offer a donation for the work we do with community. I think the links are now being dropped in the chat. Et voila. That's all. So if anyone wants to stick around and ask any questions, we'll be hanging out for another 10 minutes. If you want to ask questions around anything you heard tonight, or the professional development series, we can answer those questions. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, depends on where you are. And we warmly welcome you back to the work of PSC at any time.